Hi, Emily.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm excellent. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show. You are Emily Parker. And we're going to talk about what's wrong with America, at least one thing that's wrong with America, what the alleged demise of civil discourse, which is allegedly abetted by social media, and the concomitant political polarization, warfare between the Trump tribe and the anti-Trump tribe. A lot of things are implicated here. But you have a lot of reason to be talking about this. For one thing, you wrote a book about the kind of, I guess you could say, the subversive potential of the internet in authoritarian societies, right? Which is called "Now I Know Who My Comrades Are."
Yes.
Is that right? And
that's right.
So you looked at places like what? The Egyptian revolution and China and so on, right?
Actually, it was published after the Arab Spring, and I felt like there was so much had already been written about Egypt and Tunisia and countries like that. So my book actually focuses on China, Cuba, and Russia. It talks about Egypt a little bit in the beginning, but it's not really an Arab Spring focus.
Okay, well, the reason I was assuming there was something about Egypt in there leads us to another of your credentials, which is that you teamed up with one of the heroes of the Egyptian revolution to start a social media platform called Parleo, which we're going to talk about. And pronounce his name for us. He's the guy who started the Facebook page that was so instrumental in mobilizing support for the revolution in Egypt.
Yeah, so in the U.S., he's known as Wa'el Ghonim. That's basically how it's pronounced here. It's pronounced a little bit different in Arabic. And he, a little bit differently in Arabic. And he became very famous after administering the Facebook page that called Egyptians out into the streets and is widely seen as having sparked the Egyptian revolution. Mm-hmm. So what happened was he did this, became very famous for doing this, left Egypt for various reasons. And his story is quite interesting because this was somebody who really believed in the power of social media. He saw firsthand how social media could help topple a government. And, but what happened was, and he talks about this in a TED Talk, he could explain this better than I, but he realized after the revolution happened, he started experiencing more of the dark side of social media, where he personally became the target of trolling and fake news campaigns. And so, here's this one person in such a short period of time. So the incredible liberating potential of social media and then the sort of terrible side of social media. And so that was what inspired him to move to Silicon Valley and create a startup that aimed to create like a social media experience, but that emphasized civil, thoughtful discourse.
Mm-hmm. And you wrote about your experience starting Parleo in a piece called Why We Can't Fix Twitter that was published in Politico, I guess, a month or two ago. And the subhead was Social Media is Broken. When will we realize that we're the problem? And as I suggested, I do think this is an important time to talk about this because of the intensity of political polarization in the age of Trump. So where should we start here? I mean, why don't we start with your noble intentions? Well, first of all, what's become of Parleo? Does it still exist? Did Quora acquired it or what?
Yes, Parleo has basically became absorbed into Quora. So it's not the Parleo that it initially set out to be. It's kind of a different product, but it exists in the form of Quora, basically.
Okay. So what was it going to fix, and how was it going to fix it?
So, the idea was we were trying, fix is obviously a big word, but we were trying to approach this problem that everybody keeps talking about, which is, social media has become a place where there's not a lot of civility. There's a lot of flame wars. There's a lot of fights. There's a lot of nastiness. So, that was part of it. And also thoughtfulness, which you wrote about in your excellent article about Twitter, about how, Twitter, as great as it is not the best place for an incredibly thoughtful dialogue, in part because of the character limit, but for other reasons as well. That's just not really the culture of Twitter. It's not a good place to really get into these, deep philosophical issues. So it was civility, it was thoughtfulness. We also wanted, some degree of ideological diversity. I mean, this is obviously hard, but people talk a lot about the echo chambers and the filter bubbles. So we're like, okay, our ideal was, let's have a discussion platform where people who disagree, and maybe vehemently disagree, can talk about really hot button issues in a civil, thoughtful way. That was kind of the overarching ideal. So it was never meant to replace Twitter, to replace Facebook. That would have been completely impossible. We were a small upstart. It was like, well, let's try to offer kind of an alternative type of experience for people who also want to have, you know, a longer, more sustained dialogue.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And the idea, as I understand it, was that the only people who could post would be people who were there by invitation. Mm-hmm. Whereas anyone could read it, anyone could be in the audience, but not anyone could join the debate.
Yeah, so we were kind of experimenting with a membership platform, which meant that, yeah, you had to be invited, but members could invite other members. And we were constantly sort of playing around with this. But yeah, the idea was that you could not, any person could just jump in and, you know, start a conversation. Anyone could read it, but they couldn't, not everybody could participate. And so that was part of it. There was a little bit of a barrier to entry. Also, we had a pretty strict real name policy. So there were no, you know, so-called Twitter eggs. There were no anonymous accounts.
Okay. And how did it go? What happened?
I mean, I think, you know, it was a great experience. You know, I really learned a lot. I think Parleo, it's funny now, a lot of people say to me, we wish that this kind of experience was still here, especially now in our incredibly divisive environment. We had a relatively small but pretty devoted following. We had some very prominent people on the platform, you know, thought leaders from various areas. And, you know, and I'm quite proud of some of the conversations that we had. I mean, there was everything from, you know, terrorism to refugees to Black Lives Matter to the election. I mean, topics that really can get very overheated. We did host some conversations about those topics that were quite civil and were thoughtful and were between people who disagreed. So on that level, I thought, you know, we did have some interesting experiences there. But, you know, it was challenging, and I write a lot about that in the Political article. It's very challenging to try to do something like this in the current social media environment. And I want to say, like, just as a disclaimer, like, Parleo obviously wasn't a perfect platform. I mean, we had our flaws and our problems. So I'm not blaming this on the user, but, you know, what I noticed is that a lot of people would say, I want this kind of social media experience. And then when you tried to offer it, it became clear that maybe that wasn't the exact experience that they actually wanted.
Right. So everybody, I mean, you start the article, what is it with this Amtrak anecdote where somebody, you know, you ask people what kind of food they want, and they say healthy food. But if Amtrak in their cafe car offers healthy food, everybody orders the cheeseburger.
Right.
So, yeah, you certainly do hear a lot of complaints about Twitter. There are a couple of takeaways in your piece, a couple of, I guess, tendencies of human beings that you think got in the way of Parleo becoming a huge thing. One is thoughtful engagement takes too much time. You had trouble, and I should say, actually, I don't know if you remember, but you actually emailed me early on.
Yeah.
Tried to get me to respond to somebody who had done some dissing of mindfulness because she knew I was interested in mindfulness meditation, and I didn't have time. We actually had an exchange about it. But it's not, you know, but it seems to me you partly also face a chicken and egg problem of, like, one thing anyone is going to ask themselves, and I run into this problem when I ask people to come into Blogging Heads, is, you know, they're going to weigh the various alternative ways to spend time. And one thing they're going to ask is how many people are watching.
Right.
We have some people watching, but it's not CNN.
Yeah.
And for some people, it's not enough. And at the beginning of Parleo, it seemed to you had, I mean, you know, that was a little bit of an issue, right? You couldn't guarantee some kind of big audience.
Right. I mean, it's actually that was the core issue. And, you know, we were never saying to people, like, we're going to make your post go viral, or we never made that promise. That was never, Parleo had a fundamentally different structure. And I can sincerely say, you know, I originally got involved with Parleo as a user. You know, Wael called me and he said, oh, I have this thing and it's an alpha. Can you just come and play around with it? And as a writer and a journalist, I actually found the model appealing. And other journalists would say the same thing because, all right, think about it. You write an article and you really want to have some sort of intelligent conversation about that article. You put it on a big platform. It might get endless amount of comments, right? You probably won't read most of them. Some of them will be toxic. Many of them will be toxic, and a lot of them won't necessarily add value. So Parlio was like, okay, let's try a different model where you won't get nearly as many comments. You'll get a much smaller number of comments, but ostensibly there'll be higher quality and there'll be people who are like prominent in your field. So the question is like, would you rather have a smaller, higher quality level of engagement, or sort of just this idea of like a lot of people, but you don't know who they are. You don't even necessarily know if they're real people. So we were kind of aiming for this, a slightly different model, but I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, one of the questions we got a lot is, yeah, like how many people? And I think, frankly, I think that's part of the problem with just our social media culture in general, which is that like, we're so obsessed with these numbers and we don't even really think about like what those numbers really mean, right? Like who are all these people that, you know, you're kind of reaching? Are they bots? Are they real people? Like, and why is it so important just to have kind of that large number as opposed to like a higher level of engagement? So, you know, that's kind of the culture. And this is why I talk about this idea of, users saying they want one thing, but maybe wanting another thing. The other thing about the numbers is like, yes, Parlio was a smaller platform for sure, so we couldn't guarantee those numbers. That had partly to do with the size, but also our content was not conducive to virality, right? There's a certain type of content that is more likely to go viral. And, you know, and I think this is an interesting point in your article about Twitter, about the character limit. It's like, yes, it would be a good idea potentially to give people more space to like, to explain themselves, but also that content would probably get less views, you know, because you would sacrifice nuance and it would just be harder to read and it would be more mentally demanding. So that was, you know, there were two things. One was that like we didn't have the numbers, and the other thing was that our content and the kind of content that we were encouraging, which was like, you know, had more of a like calm and measured, you know, style of argument, just wasn't likely to explode on the internet.
Yeah, now much of journalism has become devoted to creating headlines that will go viral. I mean, journalism has become just like a giant addiction machine, kind of. I mean, or a distraction machine, you know, and you know, it's a big difference. I mean, one of the biggest changes in the history of journalism, which I lived through, was the coming of the age where you could tell how many people were looking at a given article. Back when there were just magazines, you didn't know. The magazine, the issue sold, and all you knew was how many people bought the magazine issue. Now, you got a sense of the buzz, but what's interesting is that the sense of the buzz came through elite circles. It's like the editor is at a cocktail party, and everybody's talking about this one piece in the issue they just put out. So they're hearing that from like their peers, and so they're getting a feedback from a really unusually educated and thoughtful group of people, and they were not getting, you know, quantitative feedback on individual articles from the masses, so to speak.
Right. With
all due respect for masses, so that really changed things, and I think it's taken really decades for so much of for journalism to get as good as it is at just making it hard for you not to click, you know, and that's what you're competing with. So if Parlio had launched even 15 years ago, I think it would have been a different environment.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. But again, it just comes down to like what people, like so many people in private would be like, but this is the kind of experience that I want, right? I don't have time to read all those comments. I would prefer to have, you know, a smaller number of higher quality comments. They would say that, but I think, you know, yeah, you can see they're looking more for the numbers.
Does the New York Times still run its room for debate thing? I don't think I've seen one in a while. Does it still run those?
I believe so. Yeah.
Okay. 'Cause that's kind of like, kind of like what you were after, right? I mean, interactive discourse of a considered sort.
Yes.
Now, the other thing you say about, you know, obstacles Parlio encountered is that people are addicted to the promise of going viral. Yeah, I mean, I kind of think that about that the way I think of the first thing you said, thoughtful engagement takes too much time, is that this is just human nature at work. I don't think you're going to change that. I mean, journalists have always wanted a big audience, right? Now, I guess your point is partly that they are failing to distinguish between quantity and quality of eyeballs, so to speak. Like, they're just going for raw numbers on Twitter or somewhere else, whereas it might actually be more valuable to them to have a smaller audience, but a more thoughtful audience.
Well, again, in theory, right? I mean, think about it. Like, again, you write an article, you get, say, 5 to 10 responses from people who are kind of at your level in your field or challenging you, and maybe invite you to do something. I mean, you can have some sort of measurable impact, or you write an article and you just get 500 retweets, but you have no idea who those people are and nothing really comes of it, but you have that number. Right. So I think that's exactly this idea about the difference between quantity and impact, right? Having just a large number of likes or retweets or shares, is that the same thing as having impact? Mm-hmm. Not necessarily, but I think we are attuned to really look at that number more than anything else.
Mm-hmm. Now, is it your view that Twitter is, like, on balance, a bad thing?
No, of course not. I love Twitter. I mean, I'm on Twitter all the time. And, I think, and actually in a funny way, my article, even though it's called Why We Can't Fix Twitter, is sort of a defense of Twitter, because I feel like a lot of people are like, oh, Twitter sucks. Twitter should do this. Twitter's failing at that. And my point is just, it's actually not necessarily the platform's fault. A lot of it is human nature and what people want. So people say, I want the salad. I want the healthy conversation on Twitter, but it's the users that are creating the Twitter experience, right? It's not the company. I mean, we are the ones who are, fanning the flames with our hot takes and our retweets and our shares. I mean, Twitter is largely, and Facebook too, they're responding to user desires and user behavior. So I think sometimes it's like when we get really frustrated with these platforms, it's a little bit more about us. That was kind of my point about Twitter. So I think Twitter does have some issues for sure. And yeah, Twitter could be doing better in certain concrete areas. I'm not saying they're doing everything perfectly, but a lot of the things that people complain about Twitter, I think, are more about just like human beings.
Yeah. So. Yeah, of course, the big charge against both Twitter and Facebook is that they are abetting tribalism. Whether you filter bubble, echo chamber, whatever you want to call it, you naturally wind up talking to people who agree with you, and maybe you naturally wind up interacting with people who sharply disagree in an antagonistic fashion that only exacerbates kind of tribal divisions. That's the rap. Do you think that's true of Twitter and or Facebook?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's definitely a known fact that Facebook kind of does encourage people of certain persuasions to see certain types of material. I mean, I think that's true. And Twitter also has recently changed their algorithms that makes it less strictly chronological and you're more likely to see certain types of tweets, which could potentially worsen this whole filter bubble.
See, now that was news to me when you, because what I had noticed about Twitter, and maybe this is all you're talking about, was that, at the top of the feed, it'll say, in case you missed it.
Yeah.
And what it will show me is a few tweets, like from the last several hours, from people that I have engaged with in the past, tweets of theirs that I guess got a lot of play. But it's clear what that section is, and you can just skip it, or you can change the settings not to see, but you can just skip it and go down and get straight to the chronological and comprehensive feed. But are you saying they're doing something more than that now? Yeah,
so I really recommend that there was a big article in Slate about this about a few days ago, and just because he'll explain it better than I will. But yeah, I mean, Twitter, that's one change that they made, in case you missed it. But as far as I understand, they've also made changes to the algorithm so that you think it's chronological, but it's not necessarily. Some of the tweets that you are seeing on top of your feed are ones that you are more likely to be interested in. So, and you can opt out of it. And when it became clear that they were going to do this, there was a huge commotion and people were saying RIP Twitter. But according to the article, most people have just kind of accepted it and they're not opting out of it. So we never know exactly what's going on with these algorithms. But yeah, the article also, talks about the possibility for this aiding the whole filter bubble question. But again, the filter bubble thing and the echo chamber, this is another question that I don't really have the answer to, but these platforms are largely, they're interested in growth, and so they're interested in making users happy, right? They're doing something that they think that users want. So if they were to offer a completely, I don't know, rules-free, filter-free experience, would people actually want that? I mean, I think, again, this seems to me like something that people say that they want. Everybody likes to think that they want to talk to people with different views and that they want to see other points of, but right now in today's divided environment, would people just be like, this guy's an idiot, this guy's a hypocrite, this guy is, and just kind of start unfollowing and removing people from their feed. And, this is completely anecdotal and unscientific, but, we really tried to, break down the filter bubbles as much as possible. Like if somebody wrote something about Syria, we would really actively try to find somebody on the other side. And, again, this is just a small set of examples, but I did notice that in some cases, it takes too much time to actually argue with somebody, right? It's much easier to just like if you're actually going to really get into it, that's like a labor intensive process.
It is.
Really have time for. And also, I think people don't realize, they're confronted with another point of view. They don't see it as another point of view. They see it as again, stupid or, uncivil or, so and sometimes we would have people come on and say, well, I don't want to talk to that guy because that guy's just not informed, or that guy just, is twisting my argument or whatever, some other reason that in their mind, it wasn't about the person had a different view. It was that the person was not worthy of engagement. And so I think people find all sorts of ways to rationalize not actually engaging with people that they disagree with. And they don't say it's because they disagree with you. They say it's because of A, B, or C. So I don't know. Again, I think it's an interesting question. If there was a total, if Facebook just let people see whatever they wanted, would people like that, or would they filter it out themselves?
Well, I think the filtering does start with the individual people, because certainly whatever Twitter's doing now, for much of my experience with Twitter, it has been the case that I saw exactly what I wanted to see.
Right.
Maybe they've switched that up lately, but and that's where the selection enters. And, I've tried to, I definitely have conservatives in my feed. But, one thing that's happened is that in the age of Trump, it's so weird because such a large preponderance of the establishment, journalists, academics, and so on, are anti-Trump, that it's you really got to work to have many pro-Trump voices in your Twitter feed. So there's that. But I do think the problem begins with self-selection, and it's funny, people sometimes say, "Boy, Twitter's gotten really bad lately," and you want to say, "Well, no, your feed has." I mean, these are people you chose. This isn't necessarily a universal, but anyway, there is us choosing to what we're going to see, and that probably has some tribalizing effect. And then there is the question of the algorithm, and this I think hasn't gotten enough attention because the role of Facebook in the election got a lot of attention, the way it spread fake news and so on. But what Facebook has never done is of course Facebook comes nowhere near showing you just everything from everyone, from all your friends, and
people wouldn't want that.
I guess not. I mean, yes and no. I mean, that's the way I want to keep things on Twitter. But I would like to. I think we deserve to see the Facebook algorithm, because I suspect that the algorithm itself abets the polarization. Because look, they're going to show you the kinds of things you've engaged with, right? Sure. And there's two kinds of things you engage with. Things you love from people you love, and things you hate from people you hate, right? It's emotion that drives engagement on social media. So it just seems to me like if the cases where you look at a post and go, that's kind of an interesting point, I'll have to think about that. They're not going to show you that kind of stuff because you don't either enthusiastically like it or reply antagonistically to the person. Right. So I really think there should be a right of America to see the algorithm governing it.
Yeah, that's definitely not going to happen.
No, well, who knows? You start a grassroots movement.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think there's been so much written about, how Facebook's algorithm abets political polarization. I think that's a fairly uncontroversial statement. And,
is it really? Yeah,
I think there's definitely, you can definitely see, there's been studies of what, I think the Wall Street Journal did something looking at kind of like what different news feeds that people saw based on their political persuasion. So yeah, I think it's a fairly known thing, I think, especially with the election. And the question now is, what role will Twitter play, right? Is Twitter going to be going down this road? Also, because I think, again, they're responding, one of the criticisms of Twitter has been that it's not easy for new users to join because they come and they just sort of see all this stuff and they can't really make sense of it. So what Twitter's trying to do is to create feeds that are more relevant. And so the idea is like you're more of a seasoned Twitter user, but if you were relatively new and you log onto Twitter, would you prefer seeing some micro argument that's happening in real time, or some guy talking about what he had for lunch, or, some tweet from a few hours ago that really was making news and had a lot of impact? So, and this isn't just the what you missed. This is just actually working on your specific feed. And so they're trying to tailor the experience to make it more approachable for people who are not, you know how to use Twitter by now. I mean, you know how to navigate it, but you can imagine how somebody who's newer to the platform would be very intimidated by it.
Yes, although it's not like you sign on and see all this stuff. You sign on and see nothing because you don't see anything until you follow someone. So it's not that complicated. It's like, whose stuff do you want to see? Are there columnists you follow? Are there people on TV? That's the way you start out, is using it as a passive medium.
But you and I are, in the media world, I think some people don't even necessarily know, like, who to follow or, I think you have to kind of take it back a step and say, like, somebody's coming onto this platform, they're not necessarily going to know, who's the most relevant and who's having the most interest. I mean, they might follow, CNN, BBC or whatever, but, I think it takes a little time to figure it out. And the article I'm talking about in Slate, it's I don't know how to pronounce his name, Will Oremus or
I know how you spell it because I've seen it, but I don't know how to pronounce it either.
It's really good. But he talks a lot about the changes that are happening on Twitter, and it's going to be a really interesting question because what role will they play in the filter bubble going forward? And the article does mention that there was some data that suggested that actually people did like diversity of opinion. So that, that's kind of interesting, to see if that is actually reflected in the algorithm. I mean, the other thing that's funny about algorithms is that, like, we talk about them like they're this sort of like alien force, they have like a life of their own, but algorithms are, created by humans and they're designed by humans and they're corrected by humans. So, this is very much a human process. They're not this kind of like magical thing. And I think we talk about them in this very abstract way, but these companies are, kind of working on them all the time and tweaking them all the time.
Yeah, that's true. So can I trot out this pet fix of mine for Twitter that I wrote about in the Slate piece?
Sure.
Just briefly, it just makes, like so many of my ideas, it makes so much sense to me. The idea is that there are a lot of things I like about Twitter. It's such a fast way to catch up on what a lot of interesting people are saying, precisely because of the 140 character limit. It's just like scanning headlines. Mm-hmm. The frustration is, and I think the source of a certain amount of like ill will that's generated by Twitter is that in 140 characters, you can't include the to be sure paragraph that makes it clear what you're not saying, that contextualizes it. Of course, you can do a series of tweets, but then they can get split up from one another, and one of them gets retweeted and the other one doesn't, and there you are, misunderstood. Mm-hmm. So the idea was the 140 character limit remains sacred, but Twitter comes up with an icon, like an asterisk, that you can put at the end if you want to elaborate within some other limit, like maybe 500 characters or something. So you'd see a tweet. If it has an asterisk, you can choose to click it. There will be a drop-down box with something, several times as long as the original tweet. And then there's a third level, which is if they just want to turn it into a treatise, you can have an icon at the end of the elaboration, and either they go to a whole different site like Medium, although, of course, Facebook, for business reasons, would want to control the site because this is how they'd make their money. Right. Is they would they'd serve ads to this. They might even serve ads within the first drop down. But in any event, you would have these two layers of elaboration, the final layer of which is of infinite length. And I mean, first of all, I would be much more inclined to say things on Twitter if I could throw in that to be sure. Right. I think fewer fights would get started. And finally, from Twitter's point of view, it seems to me a killer business idea because you've got all these people who would like to create content at such length that Twitter could serve genuine ads next to it, but there's no way to do it on Twitter. Twitter won't let you do it.
Twitter was talking about doing something like this at some point. Do you remember what happened with that? They definitely were.
I didn't know they were.
Mentioned something like this a while ago, but I don't. Yeah, it's a really interesting idea. I mean, I like the kind of the two-pronged approach where you have the option of reading things in your normal feed, but also expanding. I think that's really smart because you wouldn't want to turn it into a long form kind of thing. I guess the question is like, would Twitter still be Twitter? I mean, this is really what makes Twitter different is the 140.
Well, yeah, but my point is it would look exactly like it looks now, except some tweets would have an asterisk at the end. You don't have to click on them, but the point is it would be just as efficient a way to scan the opinions of the people you follow as it is now.
It seems like something I wouldn't be surprised if it happens. Actually, I mean, I think I've definitely heard them mention something like this in the past.
Well,
it seems like. But then again, why wouldn't you just have those conversations then on Facebook or Medium or on some platform that doesn't require you to? Because there are so many other...
Because, for one thing, Twitter is where the journalists are. And that's why this is a great idea. Twitter is full of journalists and aspiring journalists. Tons of aspiring journalists who would love for somebody to read multiple paragraphs of what they write.
Yeah.
I mean, these people are dying to create free content for Twitter. But no, Twitter won't let them. I mean, it's crazy. There is a business model here, I think. But that's the answer. I mean, Facebook... I mean, two things. The way Facebook started out is... I became friends with actual friends, people I know, family members, and Twitter, because of its nature, I started following colleagues, journalists, or people in academia. So that's where I want to have my debates. I've got enough trouble with my family. Some of them voted for Trump. I don't need to be airing my opinions in Facebook and further antagonizing them. You know, it's like, to me, that's just the division between the two spaces. I know some people use Facebook as a distribution platform. Some journalists do.
It's a really interesting question because it would fundamentally change the Twitter experience. Because even if you have the option of doing 140 characters or keeping it that way, now people know that they can make things longer. And what I found with Twitter is like sometimes for some people having that character limit, it's almost like the perfect excuse, right? It's like it allows for Twitter, you know, I mean, how many times do you see people say things like, oh, you know, I just can't fit this in the character limit, or I have to stop here because I can't expand. I think some people actually like that.
There is that.
I think there's a big part of it because, you know, one of the metaphors that I use in my article, another food one, is about, you know, how Parlio, we had no character limit. We encouraged shorter pieces for sure, but we had no character limit or we had no strict character limit rather. And anyway, the metaphor that I used was like, we would say to people, okay, why don't you take some time and come and eat this like home cooked meal, right? It will be nutritious and it'll be like well balanced or whatever. And people would say, oh, that sounds great, but like, who has time for that, right? And then Twitter is kind of like, here's one M&M. Just take one M&M. Like one M&M never hurt anybody. And people were like, sure, like I can have one M&M. And then before you know it, you're eating M&Ms all day. So it's like this funny thing where the same people who said that they had no time for Parlio were kind of on Twitter all day, thinking that they weren't spending it. So I think that the conception of the 140 character limit is actually like a big draw for people, right? It's this idea that there's no pressure to elaborate. Yeah. There's no, you know, so I just think it would have, I'm sure the companies looked at it and I'm sure they've, you know, and I wouldn't be surprised if they bring on a tweak like the one you're suggesting, but it would have some sort of impact on the culture of the place, you know?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, it's true, as far as the M&M comparison, it's true that Twitter is addictive. Like, it's one of my main, if I'm supposed to be doing something else and I'm feeling some urge, if I'm supposed to be doing some work, and I feel an urge to do something else, Twitter is one of the main urges, right? Like, I want to go check my Twitter feed. I've never had that urge about the Room for Debate feature on the New York Times. I've got to go see what's on Room for Debate.
Right.
At the same time, and then the other source of addiction is, as you say, when something you tweet goes viral. Oh, that's a good feeling. I want that. I want more of that. At the same time, I don't want to suggest that Twitter's just junk food because I think important work gets done on Twitter and it gets done fast and things get thought through. Things get processed. just the idea that, as I don't know when this will run, but as we tape this, it's the day after Rachel Maddow unduly raised expectations about Donald Trump's tax return. And just when you saw how fast people got the idea that there's a really good chance Trump leaked this. Mm-hmm. That conversation happens fast. So kind of analysis happens, and there's a kind of, it's the thing about Twitter is the individual contributions are incremental, and there are not many big thoughts in individual tweets, but sometimes big thinking happens collectively.
Oh, sure. I could not agree with you more. History is being made on Twitter constantly, and you're right. There is sort of like the collective hive mind effect. But my point about the M&Ms isn't that Twitter is just junk food. It's that there's a low barrier to entry. And I think the 140 characters is a big part of that. It's like, okay, like I can just like test a thought. I can throw a thought out here, and you kind of know that you're constrained. And I just think by adding that option of expanding, it will somehow change the culture of Twitter.
Although the addictive power, I usually feel more as a consumer than as a producer. In other words, when I think, I want to go check Twitter, I'm not thinking, I want to go tweet. I'm thinking, I want to look at the tweets. Probably one of them will lead me to an article that's interesting before long, or some news I didn't know. And that's the immediate source of gratification. I may want to tweet about that. But it's just depending on your Twitter, who you're following, it can be a very efficient source of that kind of gratification.
Right. But so much of Twitter's challenge is getting, more people to tweet and more people to be engaged. And I think, again, by having that low barrier to entry, I just have to put 140 characters. It's not going to win a Pulitzer. It's not going to really have a lot of depth or nuance. Is inviting to some people, right? Whereas like if they knew that they could write however much they wanted. This was something that, this was a challenge that Parlio faced, because I think people just felt pressure. They felt pressure to write something smart and to have their thoughts really spelled out. And Twitter, you kind of, you can kind of just, I do that all the time, right? I like throw something out there, test the waters. And so anyway, I think it's an interesting idea, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if it happens, but it would, it would have an impact in ways that we might not be able to see right now.
So do you think social media, the dynamics we've been talking about are partly responsible for, I want to say the rise of Trump, but I don't just mean in the sense that he used Twitter. I guess maybe partly responsible for the polarization that I think abetted the rise of Trump. Because, within his base, there is a fair amount of antagonism toward the other parts of America, because I think there's the perception that other parts of America are either ignoring the needs of the people in his base or are contemptuous of those people. But for whatever reason, I think he's been elevated by a certain amount of real antagonism between different socioeconomic strata of America. Do you think social media has amplified that?
So amplified it in the filter bubble way, or in the like Trump's Twitter feed way?
No, not Trump's Twitter feed so much as establishing the preconditions for his rise. Creating, significantly contributing to a polarization that he could then exploit.
It's it's a great question. It's so hard to tell where the cause and effect is here, right? To what extent is this caused by social media? To what extent is social media just reflecting and maybe exacerbating divisions that already exist? Trump, there's no question that social media played a pivotal role in his rise and just his candidacy and just him, the phenomenon. But again, where the cause and effect is unclear. So on the one hand, he had this platform, he had this kind of unprecedented ability to speak directly to people with no, media filter, nobody fact checking him, nobody stopping him. So that clearly, was a big part of it. But on the other hand, it's he is a reflection of our social media culture, right? He's like the king of, short, unnuanced, viral ready statements, right? And it kind of becomes a vicious cycle where, the kind of content that Trump produces is the kind that we as a society are inclined to make viral. So as for the polarization question, is social media the cause? I don't know. Like, would people be calmly and patiently listening to one another if it wasn't for social media? I mean, I don't know if I think it definitely allows for people to kind of burrow more deeply into their own ideological worlds. But I don't know that if social media didn't exist, America would be less divided. I find it hard to make that argument.
Okay. And let me ask you a related question. There's no reason to think you've actually thought about this, so feel free to pass. But do you, just in observing social media, whether Twitter or Facebook, and for that matter, observing the behavior of journalists and talking heads and so on, do you see very often in the utterances of kind of anti-Trumpers things that you think, that's probably going to make the problem worse? That's probably going to strengthen support for him or energize support for him or expand his base?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's clearly happening. Although sometimes, again, going back into the polarization question, maybe not as much as people think, right? I think because people are generally shouting at other people that think just like them. I think sometimes, I see this, and this is a filter bubble issue where, something will happen. Maybe it's like the protests over something that Trump did. And you can tell that like liberals on Twitter think it had one effect, and, people in other parts of the country are perceiving it in a completely different way. So like, yes, to some extent you're right, but I think sometimes not as much as people think, because I'm not even sure that the messages are crossing over as much as they...
and that's kind of my working assumption. I mean, as I said, my Twitter feed consists 99% of people who don't like Trump. Not so much because I've tried to set it up that way, but because I find it hard to find people I know, or for that matter, know of in journalism and academia who like Trump. But one effect of that is you kind of find yourself sneering without even... Is that a dog?
No, hold on. I'm sorry. So like no.
We could have like a BBC moment.
I know. I was going to say that's going to be a total BBC moment.
Blogging Heads pioneered that approach to journalism, by the way, but we get no credit. And then suddenly BBC does it. It's all over the world. But anyway, what was I saying? So you kind of find yourself assuming that you're talking to an audience of anti-Trumpers, and you start saying these kind of snide or ironic things, and then you realize, well, if one of those does get so massively retweeted that it comes to the attention of Trump supporters, it's probably going to make the things worse. Because in showing contempt for Trump, who I think richly deserves it, you are perceived as showing contempt for his supporters.
Sure. No, I think that's definitely true. And I think, again, with the whole, when you're talking about looking at a feed of people who are anti-Trump, I think the real danger here is just like losing sight of what's actually happening in this country, right? And I think we saw this a lot during the election, thinking Trump is losing when he might not be, or thinking Trump is flailing when he might not be. And I think that's almost more of the danger. It's like, just feeling like, everyone around you being like, oh, this is a massive fail. Oh, Trump screwed up again. It's like, that just doesn't necessarily accurately reflect.
No, it's like the Obama wiretap thing, It's like you're thinking, oh, this guy's crazy. Finally, everybody sees this guy's crazy. You look at his Gallup approval rating, doesn't budge. It actually, if anything, ticks up a little. I mean, he has rock solid support, so far as I can tell, at a pretty high level. 40 to 45% approval isn't super high, but most presidents get down to that at some point. And I think, I don't know what he'd have to do to get much lower than that. I think he's got strong support, and I do think one result of the echo chamber is for people not to appreciate actually how well things he does are playing.
Right.
So
I think that's dangerous.
One other topic before we go. I don't think I mentioned that you were on Hillary Clinton's policy planning staff at the State Department. And as we said in your book, Now I Know Who My Comrades Are, you looked into kind of the subversive potential of the internet, social media. And I remember one thing, there was a book co-authored by Eric Schmidt, who is something at Google now, no longer CEO, and a guy, what's his name, Jared
Cohen.
Yes. So it was about the impact of new technology on international affairs, and there's a line in there that says, the revolutions are now, it's something like revolutions are easier to start by virtue of this information technology and harder, I don't know if it said harder to finish, but the point was it's harder to bring them to fruition in the sense of leading to a whole new stable order.
Yeah.
Is that your sense of things?
Yeah, absolutely. I would totally agree with that. I mean, I think Egypt bore that out, and that's very much what, Weil was responding to when he even created Parleo. I think social media has been it's a very effective tool for getting a lot of people out into the streets very quickly. And when it's focused on like a single short-term action, it can be incredibly effective. What it's been less effective at doing is like creating, a new democracy. And I think Egypt's the perfect example of that, right? I think, Egypt, what happened in the Arab Spring has led to kind of a widespread disappointment with social media because it's like, okay, yeah, this, helped cause a revolution, but then what, right? After, at that point, social media actually seemed to exacerbate divisions in Egyptian society. But, I'll just end by saying, I don't think it has to be that way. I think social media still can be, a powerful tool for building civil society and for, resistance movements, but we have to it has to be used in a different way. I mean, I think it's not just about getting people to go out onto the streets one time and then forgetting about it. I think social media is still an incredibly powerful mobilizing tool, but, there's been a few examples where we haven't seen it being used that way.
Okay. Yeah, it struck me as an interesting thing for Eric Schmidt to say because, in Silicon Valley, you get a lot, maybe less now than a few years ago, but you get a lot of kind of, you might say, tech boosterism, right? Like the assumption that all this stuff is going to be good for the world. And it seemed to me that Eric Schmidt of Google, no less, was saying, well, maybe all this stuff isn't so great for the world.
Well, there's just been a really dramatic correction, right? I think that the media and just the world in general was a little bit too exuberant about social media for a while, right? It's like, this is social media topples dictators, social media creates revolutions. And then we had kind of a reality check, right? I mean, there were a few like very highly publicized social media revolutions that were seen to be failures. The Arab Spring, I think, disappointed a lot of people when you look at kind of the outcome of what happened. So yeah, there's a bit of a course correction. And I guess what I would say, though, is that like we should be careful not to go too far in the other direction and being like, well, social media is just terrible and all it does is spread fake news and help dictators. Like I feel like we're veering almost into that territory now where people are so disappointed by kind of overhype, right? I mean, I get this question all the time about my book, which is like, oh, you wrote about social media in China. Well, if social media is so important in China, like, why is the Chinese government still around? And I was like, well, like, why wouldn't they be? Like, that's not like that's kind of a straw man sort of argument. This idea that, social media by being there is going to topple a government or create a revolution. And social media is still like, very powerful for increasing transparency and for political mobilization. But I think we have to like frame the question differently. And that's, that's what's happening. So I think comments like that, they're corrective. They're saying like, okay, like some of us went a little too far, right. Let's be a little more down to earth about what social media can do and what social media can't do. Otherwise, you're going to be pretty disappointed.
Right. And certainly if you compare China pre-internet to post-internet, I think you do continue to see more social ferment, more
of course,
more mobilization to protest local grievances. And the government even responding to some of these local grievances, though not in the democratic way in our sense of the term. But I do think it's a more pluralistic place, although the Chinese government has been very, very creative in clamping down on it, and in some ways more successful.
Well, again, I mean, this has always been a double-edged sword. I mean, this is another thing that people are like, guess what? Like, governments use social media too, and it's like, yeah, of course they do, right? Like, why would only dissidents, use social media? Of course, like, governments use social media to crack down. They use it to surveil. it's part of the whole story, and it's a complex picture, and it's like, we just have to start talking about it in a more modified way. I think, if the headlines were too dramatic before, like, let's not go the other direction now where it's like social media is terrible and it's destroying democracy, because I feel like I'm starting to see people talk like that, and it's like, well, it's always going to be a mixed bag.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for taking the time, Emily. So the book is Now I Know Who My Comrades Are, Voices from the Internet Underground. And,
exactly.
And where else can people read? I mean, I guess we would certainly be remiss if we didn't tell people what your Twitter handle is after all this.
Sure. Emily D. Parker.
And are there other places you would steer them to? There's the Politico piece, which we will link to, about your experience at Parleo and the brokenness of social media. Are there other things you'd
You can find a lot of my articles about social media on my website, which is Emily Parker.
Okay, I think we lost Emily at that very moment, but I'm pretty sure it's emilyparkerwriter.com, as I recall. Wait, I want to amend that. I just checked, and it turns out that Emily's website is not emilyparkerwriter.com. It's emilyparkerwrites, WRITES.com. The other late-breaking development is that I got an email from Emily saying that what happened at the end is that the battery on her laptop died. And I guess it's just another reminder that technology is not always our friend.